Yo, what's up guys, welcome back to another video. This is another one that should set off a bit of a debate in the comments, but to be fair actually, the video that I done yesterday, from the reactions that I saw, and the comments that I saw, sorry, it seemed pretty civilized in the comments, which is maybe just because the video wasn't necessarily focused on specific things that I guess are the plans for what Trump wants to do or what the Republican Party want to do. This one is a video solely focusing on that. It says Trump has won the election. Here's our foreign policy forecast. Again, I don't know fully if the channel's unbiased. I feel like all people have some sort of biases, right? That's how the world is. But I have seen this guy before, and he seems very smart. And I feel like he seems pretty impartial. But yeah, maybe it's going to be a bit impartial either way. I'm not sure. But, sorry, it's going to be a bit biased either way, not a bit impartial either way. But yeah, we're going to check this out and see. I think this is going to go into stuff to do with, like, well, it says foreign policy, so I guess stuff to do with, like, the Ukraine war, the Israel-Palestine conflict, or war, I guess you could say. Stuff to do with, like, NATO, but then I guess also stuff to do with the US as well. Like, I see stuff about, like, how I feel like Trump wants to focus more on the US. I think that's how, maybe this is very baby sort of terms to put it. He wants to focus more on the US, put more money into the US, and spend less money funding wars, I guess, for example, with Ukraine and stuff. I don't know how extreme that would get. I don't know if he just wants to sort of end that war by not giving them money, or if it's just a different way to go about it. I'm not sure. I don't know. This is a long video, though, so I feel like it will go pretty in-depth into things, but maybe controversial. It probably will piss some people off, because I think this is the sort of things that people were voting for and then people were voting against happening in certain aspects. So I'm here to learn, here to see, because it's a big change, and I think that's why it's so fascinating. It's such a big change, like, to the last 4 years, and yeah, it's just, I feel like it's just interesting to see this sort of stuff, and it will probably affect a lot of Europeans in a certain way as well. So positively, badly, I don't know, but yeah, it's just interesting to see, and also to understand what could change. But we're gonna jump into this reaction, and yeah, let's just see what the plans are.
Election season is over in the United States of America, and Donald J. Trump has been declared victorious. On Monday, January the 20th, 2025, President-elect Trump will be formally inaugurated to the office of president, ushering in his second non-consecutive span of 4 years as America's commander-in-chief. When it comes to purely political analysis, we trust that an abundance of American and international sources have the situation handled. Instead, on today's special episode of Warfronts, we're going to focus on one critical question. How will President Donald Trump transform the conflicts that are raging all around the world? We'll cover Russia's invasion.
He's coming into a pretty sticky situation. I mean, there's a lot going on in the world. I feel like we're at quite a vital point in terms of global conflicts, and just the situation in general seems to be like bubbling up, and something seems to be coming from it. So I do find it fascinating how this will change things, if it will, because at the end of the day, the US is really the power that can help and sort of control, or not control, but like dictate things, and if they put certain things in place, it could make things worse or better. It's a lot of pressure on a country's hands, but I guess we'll see.
With Ukraine, the battles between Israel and several...
Obviously, it's not just the US, but because the US just has so much power, it sort of definitely plays a key role.
Actions in the Middle East, and a wide variety of other global wars and flashpoints will weigh Donald Trump's past performance as president, his stated plans and policy approach, his likely choices in critical personnel, and his potential points of international influence to answer the ultimate question: in a world increasingly at war, what happens next?
Here we go.
All right, before we begin today's episode, a brief note on sourcing. We at Warfronts recognize the complex nature of President-elect Trump's role in US politics, and while we will work to accurately represent the interests of both sides of that divide, we will not take either at face value. Allegations against Trump by themselves do not condemn him. Denials and defense by Trump or his staff by themselves do not exonerate him. Both unverified allegations and unsupported denials will be described as such. On Trump's policy positions, we will weigh his campaign pledges and his past actions over any attempts to deny or obfuscate them after the fact. On international matters, we will prioritize reporting by organizations that feature well-funded, well-positioned, and broadly respected foreign affairs bureaus over those that do not. With that in mind, let's begin. In foreign affairs, just like in all parts of life, intention doesn't always correlate directly with results. A world leader can say one thing and mean another. They can say one thing and do another. Or they can say and do exactly what they promised, only to be faced with a completely different set of results from what they expected. With that in mind, we're going to analyze the foreign policy positions of President-elect Trump as if they're only one part of the overall picture. But his positions are where we'll begin, and specifically with tariffs. For those unfamiliar with...
I have heard about this, about how he wants to increase tariffs from foreign exports or imports? I'm not good at the terminology. But then with China, he wants to quadruple the tariff amount compared to other countries or something like that.
A tariff is a form of tax that a government imposes on the import or export of goods, thus imposing that cost on the physical act of importing or exporting something rather than taxing businesses or consumers directly. If, for example, Germany places a 10% tariff on imports of champagne from France, then every time a bottle of champagne enters Germany, the German government collects an amount of money equivalent to 10% of that bottle's sale price. In the 2024 election cycle, Trump made a new tariff policy into a central campaign promise, and the figures Trump has proposed are substantial to say the least. Prior to the election, Trump announced that his new administration would impose across-the-board tariffs on all imports entering the United States, regardless of their point of origin or the goods being imported, at a rate of somewhere between 10 and 20%. On goods imported from China, Trump has vowed an additional 60% tariff across the board, in addition to the base tariff on international imports. Additionally, more targeted tariffs on specific goods from China or other nations could rise even higher.
This is just a question because I don't know. Is that actually feasible? Could he do that, and would that affect the other countries more? I mean, I guess it would, because the other countries make a lot of their money through the US because of how much money is just within the country. So if they lose their ability to sell things to the US, then that's a lot of money lost for them. And I guess that's the US sort of doing that then with plans to make up for those foreign exports or foreign imports, and then I guess then making them things within the US, creating more jobs. Is that is that sort of the goal, the plan? I guess that might be. I'm not too sure.
Now, just a moment ago, we explained that this episode would be focused on global conflicts, but we mentioned these tariffs for precisely that reason. More than just a tool to drive income to the US government, tariffs in Trump's policy approach are a way to serve several objectives at once. By discouraging foreign imports, Trump hopes to stimulate America's homegrown manufacturing sector.
There you go.
But that isn't all. By targeting or relieving tariffs against a specific nation, Trump can impose punishments or incentivize good behavior, while with both targeted and general tariff regimes, Trump can have a substantial impact on the economies of other nations. The president-elect himself has referred to tariffs as a way to promote peace and discourage war. Now, we'll hold off on a discussion about those tariffs' impact on the American economy, but we would be remiss not to emphasize here that regardless of partisan positions within the United States, America's allies and its adversaries alike have expressed concerns about that sort of regime, and very few have offered even a limited endorsement of such a system. We should also emphasize, however, that despite the potential for procedural challenge in the United States, several existing US laws grant Trump the authority to levy tariffs, basically unilaterally. His proposed Trump Reciprocal Trade Act would make it even easier. Moving on from tariffs, there are Trump's explicitly defense-related positions to consider, starting with his views on the NATO alliance. During campaigning
Always going to get tasty.
Trump has indicated that he intends to address and potentially work to alter, quote, NATO's purpose and NATO's mission. He's asked for reimbursement by Europe for nearly $200 billion worth of money sent to Ukraine and cut NATO funding during his previous tenure. Trump recounted early in the 2024 electoral cycle that in his past administration, Trump had personally told a European leader that the United States would not protect NATO members who had not met the alliance's non-mandatory defense spending expectations and would instead encourage that nation's adversaries to do, quote, whatever the hell they want.
Jesus Christ. It's a bit of a mental way to put it. I mean, I get it. You want to have a fair, balanced sort of system where everyone's sort of pulling their weight. So I get what he's saying, but fucking hell. I guess that's the difference, right? Like, maybe you'd have someone like Biden before, and I feel like Biden was, I guess, like Biden and his party, I guess they were a lot more friendly with NATO. Not to say that Trump hates NATO or something. I don't really know. I mean, he's definitely not happy with a lot of things, but he definitely puts it in a way that I guess a lot of Americans would probably love hearing this, and a lot of Europeans would probably hate seeing this, right? Because it's a pretty mad thing to say. But I feel like this is just Trump. He just says a lot of things that are just very to the point and even over the point. You know, that is mental. I'm laughing, but it is mad. But I get it, and I get why people would get behind that, especially within the US. And it makes sense. I mean, if you're not pulling your weight, as opposed to that, the US is also putting so much more money in because obviously there's a lot more money within the US. I get it. I do understand it. It's just a mad way to put it.
To do, quote, whatever the hell they want. Trump has not released any detailed policy proposal to deal with the NATO alliance, although other campaign statements he's made, well into the general election cycle, indicate that Trump remains committed to the goal of supporting only NATO member nations that spend sufficiently on their own defence.
Who spends sufficiently? Let's just have a little quick look. NATO members that probably nothing's going to come up. Spend sufficient. Wait, how do you sufficient? No, sufficient. Sufficient. There you go. Oh, I'm a smart boy. Who spends the most on that? Yeah, that's not what I'm looking for. It's obvious. Which nations are not spending 2% on defence? 8 NATO members. I mean, there you go. I mean, I understand their viewpoint in that. So is 2% like... So 2%, is it 2% of the country's GDP? And that's like sort of the rule of what you should spend to like, for that defence within NATO. So the US has 3.4%. Poland has 4.1%. Okay, this is a lot to find. I don't really know what I'm looking for. He's probably going to talk about this as well, but I just want to see what the UK spends, to be honest. UK NATO spend 2.5%. And wait, USA NATO spend. I'm trying to look at sort of like the 3.4%. Obviously, it's less in places like Estonia and Poland, but obviously the US is so much larger. It's so much more money. It's not larger, so much wealthier. France. I'm trying to look at the countries like this. That's not the percentage. Oh, 2% target. Wait, NATO second large. I don't know why this stuff really fascinates me. Maybe it's just making me understand more about his sort of viewpoint and America's viewpoint on this, or the Republicans' viewpoint. Just financial. You silly plonkers. The UK doesn't say an amount. It just says 2.2%. Why does AI answer? Bro, it's mental. AI literally answers stuff on Google now. Okay, so the US, the UK, and then France. But then obviously the US will spend a lot more overall because their GDP is so insane.
On a related note, Trump's frequent praise of Hungarian leader Viktor Orban, considered something of a pariah across NATO, has further increased concerns that Trump may act in a way contrary to NATO's broad interests. In the Indo-Pacific, Trump has shown broad concern towards supporting America's partners. Japan's leaders appear to be broadly unconcerned by the prospect of a second go-round. Meanwhile, during the 2024 presidential campaign, Trump's policy advisors were dispatched to speak with Japanese and South Korean officials and relay that, quoting from a Reuters article on the conversations, the ex-US president will support the two capitals' work to warm once frigid ties and advance military, economic and diplomatic cooperation to ease global tensions. On Taiwan, his approach has been more mixed. On the one hand, he's advocated steep tariffs on Taiwanese semiconductors and called for Taiwan to directly compensate the US for defense. On the other, as we'll discuss further, many of his close advisors emphasize making Taiwan the centerpiece of an anti-China strategy. On Israel in the Middle East, Trump has been clear that he would not stand in Jerusalem's way as it seeks victory in Gaza, and has not indicated opposition to Israel occupying or establishing direct rule over Gaza. Toward America's longtime adversaries, Trump has advocated a mix of confrontational and conciliatory actions. Toward Iran, Trump has indicated a return to the pressure-heavy policies that marked his first administration. During his September presidential debate against Kamala Harris, Trump specifically highlighted frustration with the Biden administration's relatively lax enforcement of the sanctions Trump had imposed during his first term in office. Toward China, Trump's stance is almost entirely wrapped up in economic competition and the use of tariffs as pressure, but he's also indicated concern over China's increased militarization. On Russia, Trump has raised global eyebrows by essentially inviting Vladimir Putin to invade NATO members that don't hit their defense spending targets, and on Russia's ongoing invasion of Ukraine, Trump made statements just weeks prior to election day.
He's going over a lot. I guess he's going to touch over all of these at some point, like more detailed as well.
Blaming Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky rather than Vladimir Putin for the start of the war. Wow. Trump has frequently threatened and implied that he would halt or restrict US aid to Ukraine during his now upcoming second term. He has repeatedly emphasized a desire to bring the conflict to a swift end, but consistently declines to offer details and consistently refers to Vladimir Putin using favorable terms, leading many in the foreign policy world to believe that a Trump peace plan would favor the interests of Russia.
Whether you have talked to Vladimir Putin since you stopped being president?
Well, I don't comment on that, but I will tell you that if I did, it's a smart thing.
On the home front, Trump's online campaign material pledges a, quote, state-of-the-art next-generation missile defense shield to guard against the threat of nuclear and hypersonic weapons. That defense shield initiative would be led by America's Space Force, although details are scarce. And when we look at Trump's first 4 years in office, we find, with the benefit of hindsight, that many of the basics of his positions have stayed consistent. During that tenure, Trump took active measures to orient the United States toward great power competition with Russia and China, something he clearly intends to continue doing in his second term. Last time around, on home defense, Trump took the unusual step of founding a new branch of the US military, the Space Force, to protect American interests beyond Earth's atmosphere. During that time, Trump threatened European officials directly with the prospect that America could abandon NATO, an act that Trump does not appear to be opposed to today. In prior years, Trump has taken a large appeasing approach toward Israel, symbolically shifting the US embassy there to Jerusalem and recognizing Israel's control of the disputed Golan Heights while pulling out of America's nuclear deal with Iran. Trump also oversaw the 2020 Abraham Accords when the United Arab Emirates and Bahrain normalized their relations with Israel, an act that Saudi Arabia nearly followed and reportedly still wants to. For the record, Trump also attempted an aggressive tariff regime in his past administration, though not nearly as aggressive as what he's proposing now. Back then, not just China, but the European Union, a close collective ally of the US, pushed back by applying tariffs of their own. As a result, the US and China ended up in a bitter trade war. Of course, Trump's public statements by themselves don't tell the whole story. In both the current conflicts raging around the world and the conflicts that will inevitably arise during the next 4 years, President-elect Trump will have to react to changing circumstances in the moment. To understand how that will go, we've got to understand the broad strokes of his foreign policy approach, which break down, as best as we can establish them, into two main buckets: unpredictability and transactionalism. Trump's unpredictability and his tendency to create or stimulate uncertainty during interactions with both allies and adversaries has been lauded by his supporters as an asset since early in his first term. Referred to in some sources as strategic unpredictability, the argument in favor of this approach draws on a time-tested rule of foreign policy. Nations make decisions based on what they predict to be the outcome of those decisions and based on whether they can assess a certain outcome will be positive or negative. But by introducing uncertainty, a leader like Trump can push other nations towards taking the safer option, the one less likely to lead to hostilities either on the battlefield or at the negotiating table. Take Trump's 2024 comments threatening not to support members of the NATO alliance who fail to meet their non-mandatory spending thresholds. The comments set off a firestorm of criticism at home and abroad, but they also created powerful incentives within NATO nations to start spending more on defense and to do it quickly. Proponents of Trumpian uncertainty often cited as the reason that major wars didn't start under Trump's watch. For example, Russia didn't invade Ukraine until Trump was out of office. Whether or not the unpredictability approach is actually effective is a matter of ongoing debate, but the principle of the thing appears to guide Trump's actions abroad now just as much as ever before. And on the other side of the coin is the transactional nature of Trump's foreign policy. The signs here are hard to miss. Take Trump's attempts to make American defense of both Taiwan and NATO contingent on other nations spending money. or take the assessments by other nations like Japan that openly regard a second Trump administration as a transactional relationship. Of course, there's also Trump's clear reliance on tariffs, an explicitly transaction-based exchange as a cornerstone to foreign policy. By attaching the actions of other nations directly to economic incentives and disincentives, Trump's proponents will argue that he can more effectively leverage real, meaningful power and authority in ways that public statements, UN condemnations, and that sort of thing simply can't match. And the intense focus on transaction allows Trump to pursue a far broader international policy referred to as America First, in which the United States openly expects to receive tangible benefits from its defense relationships while exacting payment or trade concessions from its adversaries. Moving away from the broad strokes of Trump's foreign policy approach, we turn to personnel, and specifically the people who become key to America's relationships with other nations. At the time of writing, none of the now president-elect's potential executive secretaries have been named, but speculation runs wild, and two posts in particular, the diplomacy-focused Secretary of State and the conflict-focused Secretary of Defense, will play a critical role in the new administration's foreign policy. American political news outlet Politico highlights 5 likely Secretary of States and 3 likely Secretaries of Defense. Potentially for state is Rick Grenell, the staunch Trump loyalist who drove controversy as U.S. ambassador to Germany and served as acting director of national intelligence. There's Bill Hagerty, a senator from the state of Tennessee who works on the powerful Foreign Relations Committee. He's a China hawk and an opponent to Ukraine aid who served as Trump's ambassador to Japan. There's Robert O'Brien, a former Trump national security advisor who played a key role in freeing American rapper A$AP Rocky from Swedish prison and who has deep and positive ties with NATO, the EU, and Ukraine. There's Senator Marco Rubio, a hardline voice on...
I've heard him before. Was he trying to... I swear, I think I was just watching videos ages ago of like... When Trump ran for president in 2016 for the first time. Before that, right, I don't know how it necessarily works in the US. Do you have multiple candidates? And he was one of the candidates. I feel like I remember him talking to Trump. That's where Trump made fun of his height or something. Something like that. I could be talking at my ass. And it could be someone else. But his name rings a bell, and I think he might be him, but I don't know.
To Cuba and Iran, but who's tried to bridge the gap between Trump and the importance of support for NATO and Ukraine. Finally, there's Representative Mike Waltz, a former Special Forces soldier who's taken positions in favor of US aid to Ukraine and against Chinese interests. On Politico's Secretary of Defense list, Waltz shows up once again. Joining him, Senator Tom Cotton, an Iraq and Afghanistan veteran who's been in conversations for the post since Trump's first term, and Mike Pompeo, who served as head of the Central Intelligence Agency and Secretary of State during Trump's first tenure. Cotton is regarded as a war hawk and has consistently endorsed proactive sanctioning and military action. Pompeo is staunchly pro-Taiwan and anti-China and has called the Russian invasion of Ukraine a, quote, planned genocide, and endorses the idea that Israel has a biblical claim to the territory of Gaza and the West Bank. One other name to take note of is Robert Lighthizer, Trump's former United States Trade Representative in his first term. Lighthizer was the primary architect behind Trump's early tariff regime and trade war with China, and he's likely to take a lead role in any future Trump tariffs, either by returning to his old post or serving as Secretary of the Treasury. Aside from his likely cabinet appointees, the president-elect also accepts guidance and insight from a small handful of prominent national security advisors. Among others, the editorial board of the outlet Foreign Policy highlighted the following in an August 2024 article. Elbridge Colby, Trump's former Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense, is described as the, quote, loudest and perhaps most cogent voice in Washington advocating a complete shift away from Europe, NATO, and Russia and toward the growing challenge from China. Colby has advocated for years that America engage in a full defense and economic realignment in opposition to China, with Taiwan as the most critical strategic priority. Fred Fleet's former chief of staff of Trump's National Security Council drafted a peace proposal between Russia and Ukraine that advocated direct pressure against both sides, threatening Ukraine with US aid cutoffs for non-compliance and threatening Russia for the same offense with all-out military support to Ukraine. Keith Kellogg, another former National Security Council Chief of Staff, worked on the same peace plan and supports a relationship to Ukraine and NATO that both fundamentally upholds both but leverages aggressive negotiating tactics against both to ensure they fit with American expectations. Kash Patel, a Trump-era intelligence advisor and counterterrorism director, has been repeatedly highlighted as a potential director of the CIA. Lastly, Vice President-elect J.D. Vance has advocated a peace plan deeply unfavorable to Ukraine, including an agreement never to join NATO, and agrees with the drive to frame China as America's preeminent security threat. Finally, like with any other person assuming the mantle of national leadership, President-elect Trump...
I'm just thinking, imagine them being a Ukrainian, man. They just got it rough. They just got basically Russia in their their backyard. They're not in the backyard of Russia, but they got Russia as their next door neighbor. You're being told stuff like signing things to never join NATO. I guess that's with the idea of never just setting Russia off again, because they fucking lose their temper over anything, temper tantrums, because of, I guess, Ukraine being part of the USSR and the Soviet Union before, and it's just Putin doing what he wants to do. So he says that, I kind of understand it, but I feel so bad for the Ukrainians, man, because they just want to live a life. They probably want to be more like the Western world in terms of just certain ways of life and focusing on certain different things, as opposed to Russia. And it's just you're screwed now, because Poland sort of got away from it. Because I feel like Poland and Ukraine were sort of in the same situation. Poland was part of the USSR, right? I might be talking out my ass. I think it might have been. Or just Eastern European countries. Countries that are part of Yugoslavia. They've managed to be able to become part of NATO, some of them. Ukraine is just nah, no, not going to happen.
Join NATO, and agrees with the drive to frame China as America's preeminent security threat. Finally,
Makes sense.
With any other person assuming the mantle of national leadership, President-elect Trump's actions will be informed by his connections to people outside US politics. And here we find a few specific connections worth discussing. The first is Trump's link to Saudi Arabia, and with it, the other oil-rich states of the Persian Gulf. Those links are thought to have significant financial elements. In 2021, for example, Trump's son-in-law, Jared Kushner, received a $2 billion sum through an investment firm direct from Saudi Arabia's public investment fund, while in July of 2024, in the heat of election season, the Trump Organization announced plans to develop a luxury Trump Tower in the Saudi city of Jeddah. The Trump Organization had announced another hotel project worth $500 million and located in the Gulf state of Oman just days prior. Trump has repeatedly praised Saudi Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman, while son-in-law Jared Kushner has held discussions with bin Salman multiple times relating to negotiations between the US, Saudi Arabia, and Israel after accepting the prior $2 billion investment. Also important are Trump's links to Russian President Vladimir Putin, where not one, but two bombshell stories dropped in the waning weeks of the 2024 campaign cycle. In the first, via a book by famed biographer Bob Woodward, Trump is alleged to have had as many as 7 direct phone calls with Putin after having left office after his first term. Trump's campaign and the Kremlin both denied the book's allegations, which also included that Trump had directly sent Putin testing machines for COVID-19 during his first term, at a time when those machines were in very short supply in the United States. In the second reporting item, the Wall Street Journal alleged on October the 25th that billionaire Elon Musk has maintained regular secret contact directly with Putin, discussing personal and political matters, and receiving a request by Putin to avoid activating Musk's Starlink internet service over Taiwan as a favor to Chinese leader Xi Jinping. Musk took direct control of the Trump campaign's field operations late in the election cycle, pledged to give away $1 million a day to voters, and has already shaped political messaging in Trump's favor via the social media company X, formerly Twitter. In exchange, Trump has announced plans to grant Musk control over an efficiency commission with auditing powers over the entire US government, a plan that already drew concern before the possible extent of Vladimir Putin's influence over Musk was revealed. The Wall Street Journal report claims that Musk and Putin's regular conversations have been confirmed by American, Russian, and European sources. With a grand view of Trump's policy proposals, past incumbent record, and points of influence all considered, we can now turn to the matter of forecasting how the world's important conflicts may evolve and what other conflicts may pop up during Trump's second tenure. And we'll begin, of course, with Ukraine. Trump has been consistent in his focus on establishing a quick, tolerable peace between Russia and Ukraine. He strongly implied that a peace that demands difficult concessions from Ukraine, including the long-term loss of major stretches of Ukrainian territory, would be preferable rather than continuing the war at all. As such, American overtures toward both Russia and Ukraine will likely begin shortly after inauguration, and under the circumstances, both sides are likely to come to the table. For Russia, we acknowledge Trump's consistent praise for Russia's leader, the lack of voices in his own orbit that would advocate to push Russia out of Ukraine, and the dual allegations of continued conversation between Trump and Putin, plus the alleged closeness between Putin and Trump ally Musk. Those factors, taken together, suggest that the Kremlin would have reason to believe Trump would offer favorable conditions for a peace. On Ukraine's side, Trump has been abundantly clear that restrictions or a complete cut-off of Ukraine aid is possible. As a result, Ukraine can either choose to continue fighting a battle that would quickly become untenable and potentially suffer total defeat, or swallow an unfavorable peace at the negotiating table. The precise terms of such a peace are unclear, but we can at least take a few educated guesses. At a minimum, Ukraine's territorial concessions would likely include most of the territory Russia currently controls, including the vast majority of Donetsk and Luhansk oblasts and a stretch of territory that covers the land bridge to the Crimean Isthmus. Ukraine would likely have to relinquish control over the 700 captured square kilometers of Russia's Kursk region that it currently holds, although it may gain a minor concession in return, pushing Russia out of a small pocket of land it controls north of Kharkiv. Russia may demand more, possibly including full recognition and control for the 4 Ukrainian territories it annexed back in 2022, not just Donetsk and Luhansk, but Kherson and Zaporizhzhia. Crimea would also be included in any such deal. Putin has repeated these demands as recently as mid-2024.
I can't stand Putin. He's such a dick. I'm sorry, he just pisses me off so much. Wouldn't say it to his face. And hopefully this doesn't make its way to Russia, but he is an absolute twat. I'm sorry.
Demands would include a pledge from Ukraine and or NATO to permanently prevent Ukraine's accession to the bloc, a repositioning of Ukrainian troops away from the front lines, and possible restrictions on Ukraine's future military development. The removal of Western sanctions against Russia may also be on the table. As for Ukraine, every element of Volodymyr Zelensky's September 2024 victory plan would likely go out the window. Although Ukraine would likely demand concessions in its own favor, it's not clear that any of those concessions would be heard. As we've expressed previously, transactionalism is central to Trump's approach to policy, and in a situation in which Ukraine has little to offer and little ability to make credible threats, its bargaining power in a transactional arrangement is severely diminished. Ukraine would likely remain a sovereign nation, but any attempts to secure major concessions on Ukraine's behalf for reasons other than tangible benefit to the United States will most likely be absent. As for what happens after such a peace accord, that's something more of an open question. Although Trump himself has historically shown little interest in proactive nation building, his American advisors tend to agree in the broad value of upholding the NATO alliance, and even if Ukraine is excluded from membership, it could have some practical value to the United States. If a peace accord does not include explicit controls on Ukrainian militarization, the United States may decide to engage with Ukraine as a military partner, procuring US-made equipment or sending US equipment to other NATO nations so that their kit can make its way to Ukraine. Such a deal would both help deter Russian aggression in future years and provide direct transactional benefit to the United States by stimulating America's military-industrial complex. On the other hand, any arrangement that benefits Ukraine would likely face pushback by Putin, and where Trump is concerned, it's unclear how impactful Putin's input may be. On Israel's conflict with Iran and its proxy forces, Hamas and Hezbollah, Trump's positions are no secret. While Trump has previously expressed some animosity towards Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu after Netanyahu acknowledged Trump's electoral loss in 2020, Trump's positions and his past actions as an incumbent have overwhelmingly favored Israel. On the war in Gaza, Trump has advocated a swift end to the conflict, but not via a ceasefire. Trump has indicated distaste for the optics of Israel's long-running invasion of Gaza, previously stating publicly on Netanyahu and the Israeli government that, quote, they've got to finish what they started and they've got to finish it fast, and we have to get on with life. But any restrictions on the use of force by Israel or any efforts to ensure protections by Israel toward Gazans have been absent. As a result, it's not unlikely that Trump may place pressure on the Netanyahu government to at least modify its operations in Gaza, but probably not in a way that would constrain the use of force. During his 2024 campaign, Trump pledged to cut off all US aid to Palestinians if re-elected and urged other nations to do the same. He has pledged to bar Gazan refugees from the United States, and he's drawn many millions from prominent donors who advocate the demolition of the Palestinian West Bank. While these statements don't directly lead to a specific vision for Gaza, they do indicate a willingness to stand aside for Israel. Neither Trump nor his close allies have given any indication that they would prioritize reconstruction in Gaza, oppose an extended Israeli military occupation there, or even oppose the establishment of Israeli settlements there. His son-in-law's comments on the potential value of, quote, waterfront property in Gaza certainly haven't helped those perceptions. In that case, however, and after more than a year of brutal war, it is unlikely that low-grade hostilities by Hamas or other Gazan resistance groups would actually stop. With regard to Hezbollah...
Yeah, I don't know how this war's going to stop. That's just a situation that I don't know how it's going to go. It's mental to me.
Trump has been significantly more vague, making only occasional comments on the Israeli-Hezbollah conflict and referring to it at one point in early October as being similar to, quote, two kids fighting in the schoolyard. But Trump and Hezbollah's major backer, the Islamic Republic of Iran, have a relationship that is firmly adversarial in nature. In his first term, Trump's so-called maximum pressure approach to Iran included the scrapping of a landmark nuclear deal, plus crippling sanctions on oil exports, banking, shipping, and more. Trump has sharply criticized his success for softening those restrictions. Trump has made statements suggesting that a new nuclear deal could be possible, but almost certainly on terms less favorable to Iran. The relationship between the two countries is further complicated by Trump's 2020 assassination of Iranian General Qasem Soleimani and Iran's apparent attempts to solicit the assassination of Trump or one of his close allies in retribution. But when discussing such an explicitly transactional foreign policy actor, it's worth asking whether there's one transaction that can overrule all of the others. And in this case, there is. Both via his Abraham Accords in his first term and in public statements since, Trump has been a strong proponent of normalization between Israel and the oil-rich nations of the Persian Gulf, especially Saudi Arabia. The Saudis, again, also share a clear financial relationship with Trump. As part of those normalization efforts, however, Saudi Arabia or other Gulf states may ask for specific policy actions: reconstruction in Gaza, the establishment of a Palestinian state, action toward Iran, and more. Trump appears to prioritize normalization efforts much higher than specific policies on Israel's wars with Iran or its proxies. As such, any conditions that the Gulf states introduce on the path to normalization are likely to be taken seriously. What those specific conditions would be, however, is much tougher to say until the Gulf states make a stance public. Besides the Middle East and Ukraine, there are two simmering world conflicts that will earn particular attention.
Two simmering world conflicts. I'm going to assume Taiwan and China. And, I mean, there's the civil war in Sudan, but I don't know if that would be something that would be mentioned.
From a second Trump administration. The first is the ongoing escalation between the nations of the Indo-Pacific, including the US and China, along with North Korea. The second is a wave of cartel violence in Mexico that
Mexico
appears only to be getting worse. With regards to China, Trump's attempts to directly demonstrate support to Japan and South Korea suggest that his administration may continue the ongoing policy of the Biden presidency, albeit with some changes. Over the last 4 years, the US has directly and indirectly brokered an increasingly complex web of alliances and partnerships across the region, hemming China in by creating a sort of informalized coalition and building financial and strategic incentives for each of its members to stay engaged and active. Trump's choices in advisors suggest that Taiwan will probably remain the ultimate flashpoint between China and the US, despite his past statements that Taiwan should pay directly for defense from the US, which, to be clear, may simultaneously become another point of negotiation. His tariff policies, already severe in his first term, are set for a rapid expansion into a new and more comprehensive trade war. How Trump would react to Chinese expansionism in the South China Sea, that's harder to say, but there seem to be two main possibilities. On the one hand, Trump could use existing flashpoints like the Philippines' ongoing naval confrontations with China to create a sort of red line to further expansion. That way, Trump could confront China there and daring Xi Jinping to try and push his luck. The other possibility, however, is probably the more likely one. That in a broader transactional exchange with China, the South China Sea will just be one card on the table, and one that Trump may be eager to sacrifice in order to gain a concession elsewhere. Then, in regard to Mexico, the country has seen an explosion of violence in Sinaloa state, adding on to a range of hostilities, both between cartels and the Mexican government, and between the cartels themselves. On Mexico, Trump has taken consistently hardline positions late in his campaign, threatening a 200% tariff on imported vehicles from Mexico if China attempts to build its electric vehicles there, thus skirting direct sanctions on China's EVs.
Don't stop this onslaught of criminals and drugs coming into our country I'm going to immediately impose a 25% tariff on everything they send in to the United States of America.
In past years, according to testimony by his own former officials and reporting by several major news outlets, Trump has advocated shooting missiles into Mexico to destroy drug labs, deploying kill teams into the country to assassinate or capture cartel members, and designate Mexican cartels as foreign terrorist organizations. Illegal migration across the Mexican border.
I mean, in terms of the cartels, treating them like that, I mean, like terrorist organizations, good, because the stuff that goes on in Mexico due to them it's just unexplainable. But the thing is, I feel like it's so hard to do that now, because it's probably just spread all over all over Mexico. It's probably some of them in the US, and then Central America. The cartel is just, Mexican cartels are huge, and it probably just spread to different regions like that. So I don't know how you're going to combat that. But I get it. I feel like the missile thing, I mean, would they send missiles into Mexico? They probably wouldn't. Because I think in the grand scheme of things, Mexico and the US are allies. So then shooting missiles into your allies' regions, I don't know how that would go down. Maybe he's just saying it. Like, he just seems very, he just says a lot of stuff, that sounds extreme to maybe just say it. I don't know. Maybe he would do that. I'm not sure, but I don't think he would shoot missiles into Mexico. But who am I to say?
Order into the United States was a core issue of the Trump 2024 campaign. While the specifics of any policy are unclear, Trump appears quite uniformly inclined to respond harshly to perceived offenses coming from Mexico's direction. After allegedly calling for direct deployments of US troops in the past, it's certainly plausible that spillovers of violence from Mexico may politically incentivize Trump to attempt precisely that action. As for the rest of the world's ongoing conflicts, Trump has made very few statements, if any, on the wars in Sudan, Myanmar, Somalia, Syria, the Congo, or elsewhere. But based on the broader factors that we've laid out, we can at least approximate how the president-elect may try to engage with those conflicts once he takes office. In Sudan, two Gulf states,
God, there's so much going on for him to deal with. Jesus.
Saudi Arabia and the UAE are taking opposing sides and fueling the nation's two warring factions. If Trump does weigh in, it will likely follow the interests of whichever side he assesses to be most beneficial to support.
Probably Saudi Arabia, isn't it? Let's be real. There's probably more money there.
Equally likely, however, is that both Gulf states appeal to Trump directly to stay out of the conflict, which would in turn be...
Why are those... I don't understand why them two Gulf states are doing that. It's so weird. I don't get it.
A likely outcome if they asked. In Somalia, the situation is similar. The United States has few direct interests there, and Trump ordered a near total withdrawal of US troops from the nation in 2020. Both the Gulf states and Egypt, from whom Trump has also faced allegations of accepting cash bribes, are much more substantially involved there than America. Both Myanmar's military regime and its rebel groups have little choice but to work with and prioritize their most powerful neighbor, China, meaning that avenues for the United States to pursue its own goals are starkly limited until the conflict is resolved. In Syria, efforts to battle the Islamic State of Iraq and Syria might continue, or Trump may return to his broad first-term position that American troops should be withdrawn from combat areas worldwide. In the Congo, close US ally Rwanda appears to be the primary instigator of war, and any direct US interest in the conflict would likely center on ensuring safe access to the Congo's natural resources, with little desire to weigh in on Rwanda and the DRC's fighting any more than necessary. So as we come towards the end of our episode, we've got to touch on a broader element to Trump's foreign policy approach that we've been hinting at throughout. That element is disengagement. Trump's proponents often tout his record during his first term, avoiding actions that would have drawn the United States into any new wars. And to be clear, that is what happened. But a byproduct of Trump's transactional foreign policy approach is that it incentivizes Trump and his administration to disengage from areas where there is no potential for transactional gain. Yes, it's true that by disengaging from those places rather than devoting American military presence, intelligence, or diplomacy, fewer American interests are available to be harmed in the short term. But that same approach creates significant foreign policy blind spots, and those are blind spots that China, Russia, Iran, and others all took advantage of during Trump's first term. War is expensive. War is messy. It's rarely the first choice for any nation. It's not the only metric to judge harm to US interests. Whether it's Russian Wagner mercenaries spreading across the world, or China's debt trap diplomacy, or Iran's establishment of smuggling networks to its proxy forces, America's adversaries operated in US blind spots constantly during Trump's first term. And while Trump's supposed unpredictability is supposed to keep those adversaries at bay, the most predictable thing about Trump's foreign policy, based on both his first-term conduct and his statements ever since, is that he will decline to engage in areas without a clear transactional benefit or risk to the US. Now, even if this second Trump term will see a peace brokered in the Middle East and another in Ukraine, America's adversaries will still return to a permissive global environment where
He
they
looks so gold here.
can quietly advance their own long-term goals without attracting American attention. And finally, we've
Oh, orange even.
got to come full circle on the very first Trump policy we discussed in this episode: tariffs. Leaving aside for now the question of the Trump tariff plan's impact on the United States, we have to acknowledge that while these tariffs could be used as a carrot and stick, they also have potential to be a destabilizing force. To be very clear, our goal isn't to offer a value judgment on the tariff regime, but instead to point out a logistical element that cannot be overlooked. The United States has extensive and complex trade relations with the vast majority of nations on Earth, and even if a country's exports make up a small portion of American imports, the value of the trade relationship for that host country can be far more substantial. The problem here is that in order to ensure that a tariff regime doesn't become a destabilizing force around the world, it would have to be carefully calibrated. That means going nation by nation and often import by import to ensure that the effects don't become ruinous for America's own trading partners. To invest enough government resources to monitor other nations' economies that closely would require a level of government oversight and bureaucracy that Trump's own statements indicate he wouldn't endorse. But to impose a tariff regime this extensive without that critical oversight could quickly become a recipe for disaster around the world. A sudden loss of a large part of the export economy in any nation is a massive problem. It can quickly lead to mass job loss, recession, and with it, popular discontent. When nations experience profound and long-lasting discontent, they become more likely to breed more extreme or even more violent opposition movements. They become more likely to turn away from America, the source of their hardship, and into the arms of nations that the US may consider adversarial. They become more inclined toward desperation in a world where the path from widespread desperation to outbreaks of violence is so very well trodden. In real-world terms, such a process would risk undoing economic recoveries across many nations as those nations struggle to rebuild after the turmoil of COVID's economic disruption. It would risk creating pressure points in various nations that America's adversaries, particularly China, Russia, and Iran, can take advantage of, using disinformation to fuel populist anger and driving political change that helps them in the long run. It could very easily lead world nations into an ongoing initiative by Russia to try and move the world away from the US dollar, and in countries where polarization and extremism are already high, it could very well lead to war. The argument here isn't that Trump's tariff policy is intended to drive the world into turmoil, but actions have consequences, and even plans that are intended to economically benefit the United States have the potential for unintended and destructive consequences abroad. Those consequences, in turn, pose a risk of coming back to harm even America's interests in the long term. We explained it at the outset, and we'll emphasize it again. This analysis of President-elect Donald Trump's coming second term is rooted in the past actions, claims, and policy positions of Trump himself. Once he takes office, it'll be up to Trump and those around him to guide the United States through his term as they see fit. They will face challenges, they will enjoy successes, and they will find themselves dealing with circumstances that one way or another nobody could imagine today. But for the world's most powerful nation, it'll be the man at the helm whose final say will dictate an outsized proportion of how the next several years will go. We'll be here to cover and explain.
Well, there we go. Open comments. First comment I see, we're saved. Next comment, we're all screwed. Yeah, that sums up politics. I think this is one of those things, right, where people who would have voted for Trump, you're not all going to have the same exact thoughts and wants and hopes. It's going to be, just hiccuped. It's going to be for different reasons, and you're going to have, obviously, you can have some similarities in what you believe in, but maybe some of these policies you wouldn't like to see. I'd be interested in actually understanding, if you did vote for Trump, what sort of things you hope he does do from what he said he's going to do, and then what things you hope don't actually happen. Unless you think all of the things in here plus other things are how you would ideally want his term to go in terms of his plans and the things that he says he wants to do. But yeah, this is an interesting video. It definitely went in depth to a lot of different things. Let me know your thoughts, and yeah, until next time.